It was unexpected, but I think people have learned to expect the unexpected during these protests.
It's getting extremely hard to breathe.
When the government go hard, we go hard.
The whole movement started from the proposed amendments by the Hong Kong government of the extradition bill in February this year.
Hong Kong's losing its identity, and that, Beijing is slowly encroaching on the freedoms of Hong Kong. And as we all know, that mainland China doesn't have a very sound legal system. They've got courts that don't really function as courts. They're just like show trials. And the other fear is that China might use this as an excuse to try and arrest anyone that they feel is, speaking out against their regime. So no one really trusts the legal system in China.
The protest really kicked off with the million-person march on June 9th. And then when the government decided to go ahead with discussing the bill, there were violent protests on June 12th, I believe. And that's when the first rounds of tear gas were fired on protesters throughout all these protests.
The police didn't do a great job. As professionally trained armed force, they should have an aim when they use their force. The police was very unreasonable. They used unnecessary, disproportionate force against the protesters.
Up there, the smoke in the background, that's tear gas. You don't want to get that in your eyes, and I can already feel it in mine.
You know what? It really was an accidental discovery. I was going sightseeing. I heard about this protest. Well, in fact, I walked right through this protest.
Be careful. It's very hard to breathe.
Save Hong Kong! Save Hong Kong!
People are throwing down reinforcements, umbrellas against the water cannons. They've been handing out masks and goggles to everybody. And these are the umbrellas, the reinforcements that are being passed forward in a very organised manner. My eyes are still hurting from the tear gas. There's smoke everywhere. This is an absolute madness.
It was a moment of panic. It was a moment of carnage. My mind was up here. I was in this moment of adrenaline. I was very aware of my surroundings. I saw lots of things which really made me worried, not only for my own safety, for my girlfriend's safety, but for the safety of the protesters and the safety of the police.
We're right in the middle of this. We need to get out of here. Wait, there's tear gas right there. There's tear gas right there. Ah! Ah! Oh. Yeah.
Okay.
You know, there were some actions that I saw that I didn't agree with, as you can probably see in my video. However, there's two sides to every story, but I just wanted to document what I saw.
Thousands of protesters gather in front of the Legislative Council to try to stop the legislative process.
Democracy, hell yeah!
When the government go hard, we go hard. So you cannot blame every protester who used more radical way to respond to government response. For Hong Kong, Legislative Council split in two parts. First part is elected by every Hong Kong people. The second part is elected by the professionals and the companies. So the government and the chief executive have no need to listen to the voice of Hong Kong people.
Gradually, over the past couple of months, the sort of demands have expanded beyond this bill.
So there are 5 major demands. The first one is, of course, to withdraw the extradition bill formally. There's also the demand to release all arrested protesters. They want the designation of riots to be removed, since both the government and the police have called the protests riots. They want an independent inquiry into police conduct. And finally, the biggest, most ambitious demand, in my opinion, is universal suffrage.
Every time you went to a protest, you sort of felt this sort of tension that things might escalate, and it kind of felt things could happen at these protests anytime soon. So I was stood on the main road with a lot of the protesters. I could see that these people were very well prepared for almost like a battle, you could say. And here I was turning up with like nothing, basically, like no protection, no eye mask, no gas mask either. The police had been firing tear gas for like about a good 3 hours before I had arrived, so it was sort of hanging in the air. You could always smell it. It was always stinging your eye. So I was So I kind of felt a little bit nervous. You know, what if the police charge? What if the protesters start throwing stuff? What if they start firing tear gas?
It's getting extremely hard to breathe right now.
Suddenly one rolled towards me and I thought, hang on, this seems a bit strange. How did that end up so close to me? And there was like a moment where I felt, should I run or not?
Okay, I need to run because I don't have any protection.
So I started running in the opposite direction, and with all the sort of air sort of being zapped out of my lungs, I started to panic a little bit. I mean, tear gas really does take the air out of your lungs, and it really panics you a lot.
I followed some of the protesters who were fleeing down the side streets of Shangwan. But as I went down the end of one side street, I was met with a wall of police who were also firing tear gas. But very luckily, extremely luckily in fact, I spotted a residential building with some protesters sheltering inside. The security guard buzzed me in. Go inside, was I? It was a complete and utter relief to be able to breathe and get oxygen back into my lungs.
Over the past 3 months, we saw the protesters has been largely peaceful, and Hong Kong people has been famous for organizing peaceful protests.
The protesters are actually very kind towards bystanders that have, been caught up in the protests. Whenever I turn up these protests, I always see loads of people from the older generation, families, in the shops, on public transport, on the buses, waving and giving their support to these young protesters. So it's just all these random acts of kindness that I see, which the mainstream media isn't showing you.
It's quite moving, really, to see so much solidarity, to see so many people out on the streets all expressing the same things and doing so peacefully and safely. I've had, when it's raining, you can actually count on someone offering you an umbrella or a rain jacket. There was one time it started raining and I realized I didn't have anything to protect me or my camera, and I just walked around knowing that someone would offer me something eventually, and they did. There's been all sorts of types of protests. There's been silent sit-ins, there's been the hand-holding protest, the Hong Kong Way.
Fight for freedom! Fight for freedom!
Stand with Hong Kong!
Fight for freedom!
And there's also things like the Lenin Walls, which are spontaneous, non-permanent places in public where people are posting post-it notes or posters or art to express how they feel and their demands. And those are, of course, a peaceful way to protest, and they're all over Hong Kong now.
They talk about the police brutality. They talk about how the police should stop being so brutal. They talk about sort of the 5 demands that the protesters want. Call the the government liars. So it's many different messages. It's just a way for people to express their feelings about the protests.
There's a lot of different ways people are expressing their opinions and wanting to have their voices heard. Of course, there's differing opinions on what methods really work. These protests, there's so much that happens that's shocking, and something happens every week, it feels like. And I've had this conversation with other journalists. We'll talk about something. Remember that time when this happened? And we'll be like, that was yesterday, because the days were so long and so much happened. So I think some of the more memorable times was, for example, when they managed to get all the flights canceled for the rest of the day at the Hong Kong airport.
That was called the airport sit-in protest. And the purpose was to show and educate the arriving passengers of what is happening currently in Hong Kong. And the way they did that was they surrounded the departures hall with all their materials, their signs.
People just gather at the arrival hall to try to explain to tourists or anybody arriving Hong Kong of what the movement was.
So I came back while they were having airport protests, and it was very peaceful.
The brutal methods employed by the police angered a lot of Hong Kong people. Consequently, the next day, the protesters decided to extend the demonstration at Hong Kong airport. However, the aim this time was not just to sit in at the airport, but to disrupt and shut down the operations. There were so many people that the airport was forced to cancel all flights for the rest of the day.
All flights have been cancelled. All passengers are advised to leave the terminal buildings as soon as possible.
The same thing happened again the next day on Tuesday. Flights were also cancelled.
Being within the airport in a contained environment, no one expected violence. I know a lot of journalists, including myself, when the violence did break out, we didn't have our gear on ourselves. We had them in the press room in the airport, but we weren't ready for a hostile environment at the airport. And it happened quite quickly because, I mean, the police just kind of showed up out of nowhere. They arrived at the airport and came out, and things sort of got heated from there. So it was unexpected, but I think people have learned to expect the unexpected during these protests.
In the airport, the demonstration turned ugly when some travelers were trapped or even treated badly by the protesters. This is definitely not justifiable from Amnesty's perspective. But that is surely understandable because what happened before was a big clash between the Hong Kong police and the protesters that aroused lots of anger among the protesters.
No one really wants to see violence. We don't want it to happen. But at the same time, I sort of understand why some of these people are doing it. I understand their frustrations. I understand their anger.
Of course, there's no justification for violence on the part of protesters, but at the same time, I think it's gotten this far because of how the police have managed the situation. And I think we've come to this violence because of years of the government ignoring what Hong Kong people wanted.
What's different about these protests is that it's a leaderless movement. It's like a coalition between many different groups. They call it the Be Water movement.
This strategy comes in the form of flash mob protests. These protests rapidly change location during the course of a day, and you often get different groups splitting to go to other areas of Hong Kong. This catches the police off guard and stretches their manpower. Now, the key to these flash mob protests is the Telegram app. There are several protest chat groups on this messaging app, some of which contain tens of thousands of protesters. This allows for information on the next destination of the protests to be quickly disseminated. As well as Telegram, protesters also use a Hong Kong Reddit-style forum called LIHKG to organise protests. During protests, when internet signal is patchy, attendees use Apple's AirDrop function to share information. Protest details have also been seen on the Tinder app. They have also been advertised as Pokemon Go events. Maps of the MTR subway system are shared during demonstrations, which detail when a subway station is closed or if there's a police presence at a station.
So social media is kind of at the heart of the protests, I would say. I think it would be a completely different protest if it weren't for social media. It's certainly not an equal society, but for many, they're doing pretty well. And if you were doing pretty well and you're comfortable, you probably didn't see the problem, and all you see now is violence and petrol bombs and bricks being thrown and police officers getting hurt. So I do understand why they feel that way.
There's often a place, or sometimes can be the place, where criminals from China can just flee to without any fear of being extradited back to China. It becomes like a sort of safe haven for them. So I sort of see that argument to that.
There are a lot of reasons to support the government. Well, on one hand, Amnesty share some of the arguments. For example, an extradition agreement is a correct way to help two governments to extradite criminals or suspects, but that agreement has to be in compliance with international human rights laws and standards. Carrie Lam finally stepped out to announce the formal official withdrawal of the extradition bill,
which is the number one demand, and which is the demand that kicked off these protests in the first place. But as a lot of people point out, it's been 3 months since the protests began, and in that time a lot of things have happened and a lot of damage has been done. And I think the extradition bill, while it's still a demand, is no longer the main concern. I mean, the most common chant of the protests is 5 main demands, not one less. So she's given them one demand. But I doubt it will have such a big effect because it really is too little too late.
I don't believe in mindless violence. There's got to be a tactic to it. Some people might disagree with me, but to an extent, it has actually forced the government to act. So the withdrawal of the bill was partly down to the violence, because the chaos on the streets has actually forced her to think and give in to one of the demands. They wanted it to be a big day. They had a big celebration in Beijing. They didn't want Hong Kong to embarrass those celebrations, but Hong Kong did embarrass it on the world stage. The actual event itself in Hong Kong, the protest, started off almost like a festival. They all marched together, showing their solidarity for these 5 demands and against the government. But the situation quickly escalated around 4 o'clock when the police fired tear gas whilst families and kids were still here. And then the situation sort of came to a head in the evening when we found out the news about the protester being shot. That was the big turning point of the night. That is when the anger reached a new level. So it's a very scary amount of power that the government has right now, and it's essentially opened a Pandora's box. These protests started over the extradition bill, which is seen as something that was giving the government too much power, that was allowing them to arrest people in Hong Kong, perhaps take them over to China. But now she's enacted this ordinance, which is basically even worse, because she's now got so much power now to do whatever they want to just quash the protest.
The protests will definitely go on for at least a couple of months, I would say. And I can't see why the protests would die down if there is no concession on the part of the government. So I hope that Hong Kong finds peace again. I hope Hong Kong society can find a compromise where everyone's somewhat happy, and I hope the government and the police can regain the public's trust.
我不开打。